All right, hello everyone, and welcome to your first review video. This is the review video for submodule 1.1. Of course, these review videos and the notes that accompany them are meant to give you the big ideas that I wanted you to take away, things that you can use in the future, either short term on assignments in the course, such as the midterm exam or final exam, but also ideas that you should carry over into your regular life and your future professional life and social activist citizen life as well. So these are all the different ways that we view the environment. Today, in the reading, we learned about fall and recovery, as well as a few others that we'll get to. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look. And again, the video and the notes, if I don't get through all of the notes, the lecture notes here, will be posted online, and you can take a larger, slower look at them if you wish. So in chapter 1, what are we looking at? Of course, the Carolyn Merchant essay, Reinventing Eden. A Garden Planet, the first reading that you had. Some of the big ideas that come out of here. Well, I like that it starts with Starbucks and Anytown, California, and village squares, because it captures our imagination and how we imagine or define the environment according to our own needs. Something I talked about in the preview video. So what do we see in Merchant? We see the fall narrative. It's the fall of humans into labor. It's a fallen world. Nature is no longer pristine and perfect, right? Nature can represent our dreams, our drive to escape everyday problems. Of course, on a religious level, a Christian level, it's, original sin and human flaws and not listening to God and things like that. But we go beyond that. It had a larger effect on the culture that resonates today that doesn't have much to do with Christianity, but rather with how we view the environment. That both people and the environment are lesser in some way. And this is what the fall does, right? You also have the progress narrative at the bottom of page 2, right down here, right? The counter narrative, as Merchant calls it. And what should we remember of this? What should you have taken away from your reading? That the progress narrative, or the recovery narrative, is really what she calls it more often, is through overtaking nature, and that is that we need to rebuild nature, maybe to save ourselves, right? So Adam and Eve fell, and now what are they going to do? Well, we got to help ourselves. So when you put that out into our culture, we can see that this progress narrative, or recovery narrative, more so progress, I suppose, can be applied to civilization and any advance we have. That could be the Industrial Revolution. We're using science and industry to overcome nature. But then, of course, we can also decimate nature. We can pollute nature, but pollution is just a side effect of progress, right? Of recovering and getting better at our human existence. So many things dealing with science. We could see the nuclear age as progress, yet there are also problems with it as well. But the progress narrative sort of sweeps all the bad stuff under the rug, so to speak, and just says, look, we're making progress. We're splitting the atom. We're using industry to feed people. We're bottling water, even though rivers run dry, right? But the progress narrative, especially in our writing and thinking, can hide all of the bad stuff. And so that's what we want to remember here. And we've got a nice quote from Merchant right here that you might remember. What this does also is it creates this really large binary that I want you to remember from the reading of humans versus nature, right? Nature is at our service in the Bible. That's sort of what happens. We're supposed to, remember, Adam is supposed to subdue nature. And so humans are put in charge of nature in Genesis. And that might not be the best way to think of it, because then we can do whatever we want to nature. It also gives us, of course, the stewardship narrative where we're supposed to care for it and maybe live with it in a balanced way. But at its worst, being in charge of nature means that we can pave and scorch the whole world and live beyond our ecological means, right? So we have modern implications here. The recovery version, or the progress version, basically elevates civilized humans and creates that large separation between humans and nature, right? What are the historical implications? Well, we could apply it to things like this. Native cultures, developed, underdeveloped countries, as opposed to developed countries, they're defined as more natural, but also have more animal-like behaviors, right, in some way. We could see some historical examples that I jotted down here that deal with recovery and fall. Basically, the Industrial Revolution, as I mentioned a minute ago, can be seen as progress, and we don't look for all the bad stuff coming out of it. Or we could say oh, the Industrial Revolution, it's totally awful. We are a fallen world. We're ruining and decimating nature, but not looking at ways that we might actually use industry to help the world, to improve human existence without hurting nature. So both of these are too simple, but you can see how we have applied them to understand the past. Slavery is another good one, where you see the large separation between the civilized and the uncivilized, right? That was the reasoning in slavery. So the fall version, it can lead to, well, what we have to do is recover all these animal-like people, right? All these Africans, we need to bring them over here and civilize them and make them literate. And in the meantime, they can work for us, right, as slaves, as we teach them the Bible and give them Christianity, or Americanize them or Westernize them. And we see that type of thought still going on in the world today, but in different ways. When corporations say, hey, we're going to give you, in this underdeveloped country, the free market, right? Or something like that. So we're still trying to civilize people by making them more Western. And so this is a process that continues today. Those people are fallen, and the recovery says, well, to recover, you've got to be more like Americans, right? And maybe you have to treat nature more like American corporations or American governmental policy does as well. And so we can see that these narratives apply to all of these things here. All right, so I'll trust that you can kind of work through that and think through those on your own. In the end, though, here's the big takeaway. Civilized humans dominate nature. And if you don't do that, maybe you're uncivilized. And so you can also see that that becomes a problem, because ecologically speaking, we're not supposed to dominate nature. We have to fit in with it, right? Or our own existence as the human race can be threatened. And so we can see there's some messages coming out of the Bible that can be misinterpreted or misapplied or overapplied, that would create some ecological and environmental and human health problems, right? Other big takeaways in our thinking here. That narrative guides our way of thinking. This is on page 3. We can see a bit of it right here. You can see it poking out behind my lecture notes. And this is just that the stories we're told, the stories our culture tells us, have a very, very large effect on who we are and our thinking. Over thousands and thousands of years, those stories from these cultures are passed on. And so different cultures think differently about the environment, of course, but also about anything else that we might talk about that's important for existence or for sustainability. For Merchant then, what is Merchant hinting at? Well, we don't actually have it in our reading, but we have to rethink our role in nature. We have to move beyond these simple narratives. And why? On page 6, on the second full paragraph, looking right in here, she gives a pretty good criticism of what's wrong with these narratives, right? Both are partial. They can't explain everything. They can kind of explain what happened to people or why we're not treating nature well, but it can't explain everything, because our work with the environment, meaning humans, meaning different areas of the world, different cultures, whatever it is never totally good or totally bad. So these narratives overlook either the good or the bad, because they shoot for one or the other, right? In the end, she says they're both partial and they're both linear. And linear means that everything is looking up or everything is looking down. And so all events are oversimplified through these narratives. Now, why is this important? Again, it steers our culture in certain directions and steers our thinking on the environment in certain directions. But for the next module, we'll actually look at not just literature, but some news media, where these are applied. These, partial linear narratives can be applied or over-applied wholesale. And what happens is climate change is really bad. We can't stop it. Or we've stopped climate change. Or this technology will save us. We will recover from climate change. And we become over-dependent on the story, and we don't actually look at whether or not that technology will do the work, if that technology is enough. Maybe we don't stop other negative behaviors because we trust that we can recover through technology, right? The recovery narrative in the modern age. And so these linear things that are far too simple make us overlook certain challenges or certain problematic behaviors or certain successes as well. And so this is the big thing I want you to see. These are two dominant ideas in our course. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly through chapter 2. You can take a look at the notes here if you want to go through and see some other things inside of here. Important things to point out: humans must subdue and replenish the earth. We could see this how in the modern age could lead to environmental problems. If we have to replenish the earth, go forth and procreate, right? That could lead to overpopulation problems. So we have to be careful with the messages that we take away from our religious text, right? The context today is very, very different. But we could see, a message for overpopulation potentially in there. That would be one way of reading Genesis. Certainly not the only way. Um, a more important problem is probably this, the idea that we have to subdue the earth, right? Humans owe nothing to nature. So Genesis doesn't really give a statement of ecological balance, at least at this moment where we're told to subdue the earth, right? Again, we get to dominate, or we have dominion over nature. And so we get to our third major narrative, the dominion or domination narrative. That's what humans get to do. We are in charge of it. We can do what we want, right? Maybe we can take care of it, or maybe we don't have to. And so you can see where that can create some problems as a narrative, but it's structured into our thinking that we are one up over nature and animals and those type of things. We see that in Genesis 1, where we get to name, that humans get to name the animals and all the things in the world, right? And so we're in charge of them. All right, we'll keep going here. We have the stewardship narrative. Why? Because in Genesis 2, we get a different version of how things happen. We have to dress and keep the garden, as Merchant points out, right? So we have the stewardship narrative. And so you can see this is sort of like the modern environmental movement, or any positive environmental thinking that we do. Some other messages that are inside of here then, there's gender and labor. Eve becomes the temptress. She can represent unification, but she breaks the unification with nature initially, and breaks off human perfection. And you could say Adam and Eve, but mainly it seems that she's responsible, the way the story is told, for the fall, right? So humans fall into labor. If we want to believe this, then we can see that our ideas of women as nurturing come from Eve, but also that they are a temptress, and that they tempt rational men who were listening to God. And so we can see there's some negative cultural baggage going on here that comes out of the story, if we look at gender and labor, or gender messages. There is good stuff in Eve. We can read her different ways. Eve is pure, nurturing, and associated with symbolizing nature, but she's also the reason, as I said, for humankind's loss and problems. A bigger issue that some people would suggest is that this says that not only nature but women are supposed to be overcome or subdued by men in some way. So that could be a problem. And it leads us to this big picture question right here on page 24. Are Adam and Eve colleagues working together to help nature, to restore the balance between humans and nature, and between humans? Or do they represent foes, and they're sort of at each other, and they represent different views of what we owe the earth, of how nurturing we should be versus how domineering we should be? And you can read them that way as well. But what this is doing, of course, is Adam and Eve is a great place to start, because it gives us all the different basic environmental views that we use as human beings. All right, so we can doubt this story as well and say, well, Merchant, is she really, telling us everything that we could get out of Adam and Eve? We could just say that Adam and Eve is also, especially in the modern day, we could read it like this, a story explaining what people in ancient times, and even now, already know, that life is hard work, that hunting and gathering and agriculture back then were not an ideal fun life, and were pretty hard, and our own lives are pretty hard too. And so this story captures that, and it captures the wish for some ideal where we can have an easier life, right? So the story captures everyone's dream, an easier life somewhere. And where do we usually do that? In the past or in the future, right? And this is a great moment to think about the environment, because where do we think of the perfect environment? In the past, right? Everything's were perfect before pollution, before the Industrial Revolution, before, climate change and all the things that created climate change. Or things will be better in the future. We'll invent this technology, we'll change our ways, we'll all recycle more, whatever it might be. And so we place the ideal, the perfect world in the future. We always seem to be unhappy with the present, right? And that's part of the problem, again, of the fall and recovery narratives, is it makes us overlook the now and maybe dream a little bit too much about the past or the future, right? So what did I want you to learn from all this then? The two narratives, the fall and the recovery connects to progress, which makes us overlook some of the bad things that are going on, because everything is just called progress too simply. And of course, eventually we get into dominion or domination versus stewardship. And these are our basic ways of thinking, but they're also too simple. And so we need some other ways to read nature. And in a few submodules, we'll start to get into those other ways where we can start to bust up a little bit this too simplistic thinking that does echo through our society.